Good evening, everybody. My name is Katharina von Ruckteschell, and I'm the director here at the Goethe Institute in London. And a very warm welcome to you to this lecture, our Goethe Annual Lecture 2023. I'm absolutely thrilled to announce Katie Mitchell, the superstar of theatre directors, as our speaker on this special evening. She will share with us her lecture, A Question of Vision. Thank you so much, dear Katie, for accepting our invitation, and a very warm welcome to you. Now, Katie Mitchell is one of the UK's most highly esteemed theatre makers. Having worked between here and Germany and also other European countries, her work is known for putting a premium on the visual and for bringing feminine perspectives to fore. But this is not uncontroversial, as I'm sure we will learn tonight. To borrow from The Guardian's Charlotte Higgins, I quote, "Katie Mitchell provokes strong reactions. Some think of her as a vandal ripping apart classic texts and distorting them to her own dubious purpose. Others consider her to be the most important British director of theatre and opera at work today. Indeed, among the greatest in the world." Well, personally, as you can imagine, I totally agree with the last sentences and would add that this would also apply to Germany. Every theatre buff in Germany knows her name and her work. And for a long time, she was the only female name on the Olympus of theatre makers in both countries. I don't want to talk too long and rather give Katie the time to speak about her vision. I'm very sure that you will enjoy her lecture and will have many questions to her. For a discussion and the Q&A after the lecture, we welcome Ben Fowler. Ben is a senior lecturer in drama, theatre and performance at the University of Essex. He's an authority on European theatre practice and somewhat an expert on Katie Mitchell. Welcome to you too, dear Ben. After the Q&A, conversations can continue upstairs in our library, where we invite you to stay and have some drinks and nibbles. Special thanks to Rachel Jones, who is providing BSL language interpretation for any sign language users in the audience, as well as the future audiences via YouTube. So this will be recorded. Thank you also very much, dear Frank, Francis, and the rest of the team of the Cultural Department, to my assistant Gertie, to our PR colleague Christiane, and special thanks to our ingenious technician Ho. And now I hand over to you, Katie, for A Question of Vision. Thank you.
Okay, so it's been an enormous honour to work in Germany over the past 15 years, and it seems incredible to reflect that I've directed over 20 shows there, almost one every year since 2008, and sometimes, like in 2012 and 13, 3 productions a year. Indeed, the relationship with buildings like the Schaubühne in Berlin and the Hamburg Schauspielhaus, and with artistic directors like Karen Bayer and Thomas Ostermeier, plus actors like Julia Wieninger and Jenny Koenig, have enriched my practice immeasurably. I want to thank the Goethe Institute for this opportunity to reflect on the productions and the relationships I've made in Germany, and to explore with you the differences between German and British theatre as I experienced them, and how my interaction with German culture changed the course of my directing practice. In 2006, in the UK, I directed an adaptation of Virginia Woolf's novel The Waves, combining techniques from film and theatre into a hybrid form of theatre making that was later called live cinema. In live cinema, the onstage action is filmed by several camera operators, edited live, and then projected onto the screen above. It's as if the audience were watching a film shoot at the stage level at the same time as watching the finished movie in a cinema on the screen above the staged action. The central character's story is carried mainly by visual elements, and this means that there may be very little or no dialogue. The text mainly takes the form of a voiceover conveying the internal thoughts of the character. Of the 20 or so productions I have directed in Germany between 2008 and now, well over half of them have been live cinema productions. And it's no accident that the technique that established my reputation in Germany is predominantly a visual one. When I was first invited to direct in Germany, I was naturally cautious about working with a language I did not speak and in a culture I did not know. So when I met Karin Bayer to discuss directing at her theatre in Cologne, I suggested that live cinema offered the best entry point for me because it was not centred on language. Okay, she said, and what do you want to direct then? I purposefully chose a text with no words, Request Programme by Kreutz, a play from the 1970s about the last hour of a woman's life where she listens to a radio request programme before committing suicide. How do you want to do it then? Karin asked. I took a white napkin from the cafe table and sketched out some rough staging ideas with an old black biro. My drawing looked more like an enormous film shoot than a theatre production. What do you need? Karin asked. I'd like a film set, a large film screen and 5 cameras. Okay, she said. And my German odyssey began. This was my first experience of the German approach to programming, where the vision of the director determines whether the production is scheduled. By comparison, in the UK, the brilliance of the play text will determine the programming decisions, and the director is chosen much later down the line. The German theatres are very competitive about their directors. Indeed, it's an unspoken rule in Germany that the first theatre in any city to employ a director expects a strict loyalty, making it impossible for that director to work at another theatre in the same city. The theatre repays the director's loyalty by offering a long-term commitment to programming that director's work if the work stays at a high enough standard. This system of exclusive services would be hard for British directors because so many theatres and theatre companies are based in London, a city which still receives large sums of national funding, despite the Arts Council's recent controversial attempt to spread the funding more evenly across the country. By contrast, German arts funding is famously decentralised, and every major city in the country has at least one large theatre with high levels of state funding. Imagine, I often think, if there were 1 or 2 theatres just like the National Theatre in London in every major city in the UK, and you'll have a clearer picture of what it's like in Germany. It was raining stair rods when I flew into Cologne in autumn 2008. After adjusting to the predominance of post-war architecture in the city and eating off laminated placemats in my digs showing the destruction of Cologne after the Allied bombing raids in the 1940s, all of which was helping to shift my somewhat two-dimensional and unbalanced British view of the Second World War, I found myself in an industrial estate on the outskirts of the city. And here in a chilly concrete building, we were to start work. I say we because the whole creative team, set, video, lighting, costume and sound designers, plus the composers, were British. We were all rather nervous about starting work in Cologne because none of us spoke any German. The first thing I noticed on day 1 of rehearsals was that most of our German colleagues, actors, technicians, dramaturgs, spoke English. And the German team's bilingualism across all departments meant that we were able to rehearse predominantly in English. As I directed more live cinema productions in Germany, our reliance on everyone's bilingualism settled into a fixed working pattern. We would rehearse the scenes in English for the first few weeks, and then the actors would modulate to German for the last 2 weeks. This allowed the sound, lighting, stage management, and video departments to do most of the initial programming around the English voiceover text. The next thing I noticed about German theatre practice was that there was no stage manager, as we understand the role in the UK. That is, someone to run the rehearsal room and to coordinate everyone's schedules. Instead, this job was split between the dramaturg, the assistant director, and the German version of a stage manager. Furthermore, unlike the UK, the assistant director's function was more administrative than artistic, and the German stage manager was mainly responsible for cueing people on or off stage. I also noticed that there was not a production manager on the team. In the UK, the production manager is the person who coordinates the budgets and the schedules of all the different technical departments and who oversees the installation of any technical equipment or scenery in the theatre or rehearsal room. Initially, it took longer to get things done in our rehearsal room because the organisational glue of the stage manager and production manager was missing. However, I was struck by how much responsibility and power the dramaturgs had. Dramaturgs in Germany not only work with the director on individual productions, they are also responsible for the programming of the season, the selection of the directors, the casting of the actors, the content of the theatre programme booklet, and the communication between everyone in the rehearsal room and all the relevant theatre departments. In fact, they are like large intellectual octopuses with multiple arms across every inch of the theatre organisation. Over the first few weeks of rehearsals, we found a way to bring our German and British systems into a third hybrid practice, which was enriching and fulfilling all round. Of course, I would be lying if I didn't say that the process required hours of careful conversation, where assumptions and post-war unconscious biases were regularly unpicked on both sides. We were all constantly tripped up by cultural differences. For example, there was the very difficult question of the sandwich in scene 2. Our set designer, Alex Eels, prepared a sandwich with 2 slices of bread with some salami and salad in between, only to be met by confused looks from the actors, for whom a sandwich is 1 slice of bread with a slice of meat on it and a couple of gherkins. Or there was the heated discussions about our request to put a plug socket in the scenic bathroom for a hairdryer, when this was against German health and safety regulations in domestic bathrooms, and so on. These stumbling blocks were more than made up for by the willingness of the actors to do whatever I asked them to do, often without question. Indeed, the more difficult the request, the more pleasure the actors took in rising to the challenge of solving it. In the UK, the question the director is most often asked by an actor is, why? Whereas in Germany, the most regularly asked question is a quick, what? Once the German actors have an answer to this question, then they will beaver away for ages working out how to achieve what you want. For example, in 2013, I asked the actors to rewind the final 20 minutes of the play I was directing at double speed. They had to keep all the naturalistic detail of the actions and spoken words precise, but rewind them. The actors immediately asked to record the forwards version of the naturalistic scene and then spent hours poring over the rewound film version, working out exactly how to do every inch of this complex naturalistic scene backwards. I don't want to be negative about British actors, who I owe a great deal to, and I'm not saying that actors asking a question, why, is problematic. It's just that for the director, no amount of conversation can replace the simplicity of testing out an idea in action. And the German performers are very used to this protocol because they work in so many different experimental forms and genres. Directing in Cologne, with increased staffing levels, larger budgets and creative producing, turbocharged the evolution of live cinema. Instead of the small handheld backdrops we had used in the UK, we were now using large film sets with flown walls. Pre-recorded music was replaced by a live string quartet in a sound-sealed glazed box, and we were using 6 cameras instead of 3. The small-scale text, a short one-woman play with no words and a few simple actions, combined with the large-scale use of the technology deployed to realise it, created this amazing tension between content and form. And most importantly, from a feminist point of view, all this huge technological effort was being used to articulate and centre the quiet despair of one lonely woman listening to the radio in her flat, a woman whose lived experience is normally politically disregarded or presented theatrically in a small-scale production in a studio theatre. It would be impossible to stage this tiny one-woman text on a mainstream stage in the UK, unless, of course, you had a superstar like Cate Blanchett to play the role. And even then, I don't imagine a British artistic director would be confident to programme a play where there are no words, only actions. Request Programme was well received in Germany, predominantly because it introduced the German audiences to live cinema. And in May 2009, the production was invited to the Theatertreffen. For those not familiar with the Tomato-Treffen, the Theatertreffen, my fantastic German is still really imperfect. Anyway, for those not familiar with this, it's the annual National German Awards ceremony. Unlike the glitz and glamour of the UK Olivier Awards, where there is always a clear winner in each category, at the Theatertreffen there are no winners of individual categories. Instead, the 10 best productions that year are performed in a 2-week-long festival in Berlin. By doing this, the award festival replaces the idea of best with a nuanced idea of plurality, acknowledging how many ways there are of making theatre and the impossibility of creating an appropriate value system to measure the diversity of work made in any one year. The Minister of Culture launched that year's Theatertreffen, and I was leaning in close to my German assistant Stefan to hear his whispered simultaneous translation. After a few words of welcome, the minister spoke about the difficult economic situation the country was facing. I braced myself for an announcement of a cut in arts funding, used as I was to the way politicians in the UK view culture as the first thing to cut when things go wrong economically. To my complete surprise, Stefan whispered, "He is announcing an increase in arts funding." "A decrease?" I asked. Not sure if I had heard correctly. "No, an increase." I said, "That's not possible," I whispered back. "Welcome to Germany," Stefan replied. My jaw dropped. Blimey, I thought, I'm in a country which understands and values the function of culture. Of course, this was early on in my understanding of arts funding in Germany and reflects the optimism of the noughties. The combination of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine have taken their toll on German theatres, and most of them are now tightening their belts like we are in the UK. Next year, for example, there will be a cut in the arts budget in Germany of around 12%. Nonetheless, compared to the recent cuts in the UK, the funding situation is still buoyant in Germany. This strong connective tissue between the socio-political realities in the broader society and theatre practice in Germany was brought home to me even more 7 years later when I was working at the Hamburg Schauspielhaus on an adaptation of Herta Müller's novel Travelling on One Leg. Müller's book is about the year-long wait the Romanian writer experienced in Berlin in the 1990s as her application for permanent residency was processed. By strange serendipity, the technical rehearsals for our production about immigration coincided with Angela Merkel's decision to open the borders to allow millions of migrants into Germany. For those who don't know, the Schauspielhaus in Hamburg is literally opposite the train station, and on the morning the refugees were due, I saw the station staff erecting large white UNHCR processing tents in the station forecourt. By lunchtime, a group of refugees had been invited into the theatre canteen by the artistic director, Karin Bayer, to protect them from any possible violence. There was a loud pro-refugee rally going on outside the theatre, and the authorities were concerned that there might be a clash between the people attending the rally and a group of neo-Nazi protesters who were on their way into the city. In the end, there was no clash, as the neo-Nazis were successfully held in a train outside Hamburg like wasps in a jar. But it wasn't just that Karin Bayer, now artistic director in Hamburg, hosted the refugees in the theatre canteen for a couple of hours that day. In response to the number of arrivals and the pressure this was putting on the city to house them, she, like many organisations in Hamburg, took immediate action. She closed the studio theatre, removed the seating, and set up 20 beds in the empty auditorium. Every night, refugees would sleep in those beds before being processed in Hamburg the following day or heading off further north to Scandinavia. The refugees were initially too afraid to go to sleep in case their meagre belongings were stolen, especially their phones. So the theatre staff put together a night shift rota to ensure that there were always 2 members of staff watching over the refugees in the night, thereby allowing them to sleep peacefully. Karen personally oversaw the changeovers of the 20 beds every day for 3 months. Miss Julie at the Schaubühne was my second job in Germany. and I swapped one chilly warehouse in Cologne for another equally cold warehouse on an industrial estate outside Berlin. This time the cold was somewhat mitigated by the hot lunches cooked daily on site by a crazy vegan chef called Dietmar. Furthermore, my British creative team and I took the lessons about how to work in Germany with us from Cologne to Berlin, and consequently we had a smoother process. Initially, the Schaubühne wanted to have a well-known title, as I was then a little-known director. But once the title was agreed, I was struck by the fact that they didn't really mind how I directed the play, as long as I used the live cinema technique. The production ended up critiquing the misogyny in the original 19th century Scandinavian play by using live cameras to show the action of the play exclusively from the point of view of the least important marginalised female character, Christine the cook. When Christine fell asleep in the scene between the two main protagonists, we fell asleep with her and entered her dreams. When Christine left the room where the two protagonists play out their major scene, we followed her down the corridor of the house, the sound of the famous scene fading as she walked away. As a result of this concept, 60% of the original play was cut, and I added new voiceover text to articulate the inner thoughts of the cook, taken from the poetry of a contemporary feminist Danish poet, Inger Christensen. The word, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so maybe you can help with it, is consequent, is that right? So the word consequent was regularly used in discussions about this concept, and this was a new word to me. To be consequent meant to follow through an idea to its most logical, consistent, unremitting endpoint. So when this word is used to talk about directing, it refers to the degree to which the concept is effectively unfolding minute by minute in the action on stage and where the concept concludes. As I worked between Germany and the UK, I noticed how I was always told to pull back my conceptual ideas in Britain, or as one British critic so kindly put it, to stop putting my dirty fingerprints all over the play. Whereas in Germany, I was told to go further with my conceptual ideas, to be more consequent. Sometimes my German colleagues would also use the phrase, "Oh, Katie, don't be so British," for any aspects of my concept that weren't followed through. I realised that for them, the word British, with regards to theatre directing, was synonymous with caution and convention. In Britain, meanwhile, I was criticised for being too German. This cultural snobbery on both sides made me understand why it is that the UK exports so many new plays to Germany, but almost no productions or practitioners. It's not because a production in English would pose insurmountable language barriers for a German audience, as so many people in Germany speak English, and it's not that the British directors are unskilled. It's just that British theatre making, particularly British directing, is often looked down on by German practitioners for its conceptual weaknesses. Just as, in reverse, the British theatre establishment looks down on German theatre because it's too focused on the director's concepts. As time passed, I realised that this mutual cultural snobbery was a result of two very different views of the hierarchy and function of the key practitioners involved in the process of making a production. So in British theatre practice, the hierarchy is writer first, actor second, director third. It's interesting, isn't it, this? In Germany, it is director first, yes, actor second, and writer third. So whereas it is perfectly possible in the UK to go to a production and not remember the director's name, recalling instead the name of the writer or the lead actor, in Germany it is impossible to go to the theatre and not know who the director is. In fact, you can almost claim that audiences go to the theatre in Germany to watch the directing, and audiences go to theatre in the UK to watch the playwriting. It's hard as a British person to understand the position that directors hold in the German-speaking culture. Their power was brought home to me one day whilst I was sitting in an open-air cafe in Salzburg. Fluttering in the wind across the square from where I was sitting were 3 15-metre-high banners, each with an enormous black and white photograph of a middle-aged man on them. At the bottom of the banners, there was the name and dates of an opera production, which I couldn't quite read. Who are the men on the banners? I asked my host, Jürgen Flimm, the intendant of the Salzburg Festival. Guess, he said. Are they the writers? I asked. No, said Jürgen. The opera singers? No, said Jürgen. The characters in the opera? No, replied Jürgen. Then who are they? I asked. The directors, of course, Katie, said Jürgen with a self-satisfied grin. On reflection, I would have preferred to see female faces on the banners, but just as in Britain, there's still some way for German directing practice to go when it comes to gender equality. Thomas Ostermeier is, of course, one of the most famous German theatre directors of his generation. So when he came to watch an early rehearsal of Miss Julie, I was eager, or rather nervous, to know what he made of the work. What are you thinking? I asked. To be honest, Katie, I'm feeling very sick. Why? I asked, taken aback. Because we've never had period costumes in this theatre since I took over in 1999. And if there weren't video cameras on stage, I'd ask you to get rid of the costumes straight away. To Ostermeier's mind, period costumes did not just equate with uninterrogated historical reconstructions of classical texts, it also indicated a production that was going to be naturalistic. A similar conversation happened a few years later when I was directing a new version of Phoenician Women in Hamburg. It was the final dress rehearsal and Karen Bayer was watching. Look, the ancient Greek costumes have to go, Katie. We never use historical costumes in Germany. If you keep them, the production will be completely misunderstood. But why is that, Karen, I asked? We don't do naturalism here. Okay, I said, but we can't replace all the costumes now with a day to go before the opening night, I replied. Well, of course, it's your choice, she said, rather disingenuously. But if it were me, she said, I'd get the costume designer straight to Primark and buy some simple, cheap modern clothes, which is, of course, exactly what I did, trusting, as always, to Karen's superior understanding of her home audience. And yes, she was completely right. The production was stronger without those British naturalistic togas. In fact, she really made me laugh a few years later when she was talking about the future of theatre and said, do you know, Katie, I think naturalism may be coming back, as if she was talking about the arrival of aliens from another planet. All this is to say that naturalism as a way of theatre making is dead in Germany and probably died quite a few years before I started working there. This makes it quite tricky if you've come from Britain, where naturalism or realism, I think the two words are used interchangeably here, is the default setting for most theatre productions. I'd spent the first 16 years of my career developing my own particular brand of naturalism, combining Stanislavski's techniques with the British text-based tradition. But it's no surprise, I suppose, that my work in Germany coincided with my disenchantment with the efficacy of naturalism and my exploration of live cinema to re-centre female experience. In fact, as I was making Miss Julie, I sometimes felt like a young kid going behind the bike sheds to smoke, because I knew I would never have been allowed to stage my German production of Miss Julie in the UK, where doing the play so often means doing all the words in the play text in a default naturalistic style, and where there is a somewhat inexplicable resistance to conceptual approaches to theatre making. I say inexplicable because to my mind, a healthy culture should have a broad spectrum of directorial approaches, and there is too much trouble going on in the world already for us to add to it by policing art. I also started, after Miss Julie, I also started to use the live cinema technique to adapt novels. There are so few classic theatre texts written by women, and staging novels allowed me to expand the repertoire of canonical texts covertly to create more text for theatre that represent female experience. I directed productions by writers like Frederica Mayerocker, Jelinek, Virginia Woolf, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and Maggie Nelson. The novel form was also better suited to the live cinema technique, because novels often explore the thoughts inside a person's head as much as their words and actions. Alongside staging adaptations of novels, the live cinema technique also explored more and more complex locations, like scenes set on moving trains, on aeroplanes, or in cars. The simulating of cinematic motion was at the heart of many of the live cinema technological advances. The most exciting production of all, and my all-time favourite, was Maya Rocker's Journey Through the Night, or Night Train. The adaptation told the story of a husband and wife's journey from Paris to Vienna to attend the funeral of the woman's father. The theatre purchased a whole Deutsche Bahn railway carriage for us, and it was repurposed by the set designer Alex Eels to house a rotating twin-bed compartment where most of the action took place, and other rooms for flashbacks in the characters' past. Rotating lights were constructed and were manually operated to give the impression that the characters were sitting on a fast-moving train with the street lights whizzing past them. The tension between the stationary train carriage on the stage, housing the film shoot, and the short film about a woman on a train projected simultaneously on a 20-metre screen above that carriage was breathtaking. I owe a great deal to my creative team and all the actors and technicians in Cologne for making that production possible. Indeed, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to all the British and German practitioners who have worked with me over the past 15 years. Nothing is possible without a team, and nothing is more beautiful than a cross-cultural team. It's not only that Germany welcomed my conceptual approach to theatre making, my feminist lens, and my interest in formal experimentation, it also responded to my growing interest in the intersection between gender, theatre, and the climate change. In 2013, I directed Duncan Macmillan's play Lungs at the Schaubühne, about a young couple working out whether to have a baby in the light of the climate catastrophe. This was directed as an off-grid production where the actors seated on stationary bikes powered the electricity to light their faces and to power the sound system. And in 2022, I directed the now infamous production of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard from the point of view of the trees. The critical reception of my work in Germany has gone up and down over the years since the early success of Request Programme, with much negative criticism rightly centred on my decision in 2016 to describe myself as a feminist theatre director. That really set the cat among the pigeons, and I have often reflected on whether I should have found a more thoughtful way to describe my focus on female experience that didn't cause so much offence, because of course feminism can mean so many different things to different people, and for me to claim the word for my own practice without defining my understanding of it was a textbook error in gender politics communication. From the British press point of view, I suppose I remain surprised that they barely found their way out to Germany to review anything I directed, as if by working in a foreign language I was almost rendered foreign. When I first started working in Germany, I'd always ask the press officer, "Are there any British press coming?" I was always met with an embarrassed no. In the end, I gave up asking and thought, oh well, I must have become German. On the weekly long night train journeys between Britain and Germany that I took to be with my daughter in London at the weekends, I often reflected on the difference between theatre making in both countries. As the trains hurtled past city street lights or moonlit mountains, I reflected on why it was that I was asked to honour the text in Britain, whereas in Germany I was asked to challenge the text. Why it was that in Britain I was told to be less radical, and in Germany I was told to be more radical. Very early on in this cross-cultural adventure, I almost lost sight of who I was as an artist and what work I wanted to make, because the unspoken requests on my artistry in the two countries were so diametrically opposed. I felt like a rag doll with a country pulling on each arm. It's also fair to say that the misogyny and rage of the British critics at the time about the work I directed in London was overpoweringly oppressive, even though the shows I made in Britain were not radical at all compared to the productions I was to make in Germany. In the UK, I was othered as a woman, as a pro-European, and as a conceptual director. In the end, I did decide to jump ship for a while, not to live in Germany, because I've always lived in London, but to work there. I did this because I felt that German theatre provided me with a more nurturing professional environment, and because Germany, although not free from sexism in the workplace, was politically more open to different forms of feminist and conceptual expression. Working in Germany has also pushed me artistically to do things I never imagined I could, and to direct projects I could only have dreamt of doing if I had stayed in Britain. And I am enormously proud to have pioneered a career as a theatre director in Germany that no British woman or man has ever achieved, and in doing so, I hope to provide a model to young British women today, which proves that they too can forge a path outside the constraints of British culture, or move between the cultures to the benefit of both. Brexit has accentuated an already inward-looking and isolationist theatre culture in the UK. But there are signs that the new generation of theatre makers are starting to push back and are beginning to reconnect with a European vision of collaboration and exchange. I am also aware that there are aspects of theatre making, like questions of diversity and intersectionality, where Britain may be steaming ahead and Germany may in fact be falling behind. Writing this lecture has provided me with a wonderful opportunity to reflect more fully on what I have learnt in Germany and how I was shaped by working there, and will continue to be. It goes without saying that I have, of course, learnt a great deal about German industrial estates, vegan cooking, sandwiches, and hairdryer laws. But sadly, I have failed completely to learn the language. In the end, I don't favour German theatre practice over British theatre practice, although there have been times when I have. Now I feel that a perfect culture would be one that operates with the vision and values of both countries, with the strength of the British text-based tradition and the power of the German conceptual directing culture, with the asking of why, as well as the asking of what, with formal experimentation being as valued as much as naturalism. And if you asked me about the future of theatre, I may respond, do you know, I think that the idea of working across national and cultural boundaries may be coming back. Thank you.
Okay, I think, perfect, the microphone's working, good.
Is mine working?
Let's test. Wonderful.
Technology, eh?
Technology. Live cinema. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Katie, for the lecture that you've just given us. Really, really fascinating. My name is Ben Fowler. I'm from the University of Sussex. And I'm going to begin by asking a couple of questions, and then we're going to open up to questions from the floor. So if you've got any ideas percolating, keep hold of them. We've got about 25 minutes for questions, and I believe afterwards you're all invited to a wine reception in the library upstairs. I'm sure there are non-alcoholic drinks available as well. Katie, I'll give you a moment just to catch a breath. I'm going to start by asking you a question about your relationship with actors, but to sort of get me there, I'm going to speak for a minute. So I discovered Katie's work back in 2003 when a friend took me to see a production of Three Sisters at the National Theatre. And I was completely blown away by the exquisite naturalism of the piece, and the extraordinary quality and concentration of the ensemble acting. And what I really admired about your work in the noughties in London was that you were finding ways of working in a European way within the constraints of the British system. So working with actors repeatedly to create a sort of informal ensemble, regardless of the fact that British culture is kind of like a production line. You know, you're all employed on a freelance basis and moving from project to project. So I love these sort of relationships with performers that were evolving over the years. And your interest in process and trying to maximize rehearsal time, and working in a way that was quite different, I think, from your peers. So my first question is really about your relationship with actors in Germany, where they have a very different system, which is the ensemble system. So for those who don't know, in the theatres that Katie's been working in, many of the actors are employed on permanent contracts as members of the ensemble. And I know that a number of the actors that you've worked with across a number of years, across many projects. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that has offered you as a director, working with actors in these ensembles, and how that has kind of stretched your practice.
Yeah, it's an important question, isn't it? But as you've noticed, that in the UK, I already created a fixed group of performers, really. I mean, it wasn't very formalised, but it was the same group of actors who were working repeatedly with me and developing a lot of the sort of techniques for naturalism that I worked on over the years. So when I went to Germany, I just formed the same type of relationship, but it was just made easier that the actors were always in the fixed ensemble, whereas in the UK, I would always have to persuade the artistic director to let me have the group of actors that I wanted, and that was quite conflict. So I just did the same thing in Germany, but it made my life much easier. So I could repeatedly work with actors. And I'm not someone who likes new working relationships, because I like to do very difficult things. And to do very difficult things, you need to have a shorthand and a lot of trust with the people that you work with, either actors or the creative team. So, of course, it was amazing having sort of performers like Julia Wieninger in Cologne and then in Hamburg, who I could work with again and again over years and build up a fantastic sort of language.
Yeah, I remember in particular, actually, I had the pleasure of sitting in on some of your rehearsals in Hamburg back in 2017, when you were working with Julia Wieninger, am I saying her name right? On 448 Psychosis, a Sarah Kane play. And the concept behind that production was that it was a one-woman monologue, and she was walking on a travelator for the whole of that production. So the idea was that she was leaving an apartment near the Hauptbahnhof in Hamburg at 4:48 in the morning and walking through the city to some train tracks where she arrives at the end of the piece. And conceptually, it was really, really striking. There was an actor on a travelator, which was being operated from the side of the stage, and there were a number of technicians who were doing live Foley sound effects of her travelling across various surfaces. So an extraordinary team effort in terms of the technical support behind that. But I really noticed in the rehearsals how much the performer relished the kind of technical problem that you were posing, how to sort of balance the very careful naturalism with the demands of this very technical work of working out how to be on the travelator. And I noted down something that you said.
Oh dear.
So it's coming back to revisit you now, but I remember you saying about Julia that the actor is imagining this so much that the director is trying to keep up. And I'm wondering if there's something about the way in which these German performers are meeting the challenges that you're setting that is really sort of taking your practice to a different level or allowing you to do things that maybe you wouldn't have tried before.
I wish I could say yes, but I had a reunion recently with all the actors I worked with in the UK doing the early live cinema experiments on Waves. And as I was sitting there, I realised there's no difference actually between this group of amazing actors, British actors, and the German actors. Not such a huge difference. And that I'm drawn, I think, to a certain type of person, which is a person who's very sort of curious and very intellectual and very prepared to try things. And I think I just search those people out wherever I am, be it in Germany or in the UK. But maybe in Germany the difference is it's everyone else in the room, all the technicians are working in a very different way to support what the actor is imagining. So there's more intensity in the rehearsal room. But obviously, Julia Wieninger is my favourite actor of all time and is unbelievably good at acting. So I'm always going to feel behind her capacity, really. I'm reliant on it.
I'm just going to ask a couple more things and then we'll open up to the audience. But I'm particularly interested in the title that you chose for this lecture, A Question of Vision. And it made me think about how before you went over to Germany, your kind of approach to directing seemed to be very much about trying to achieve an objective reading of a play text, to see what the play's doing, to see what the play's ideas are. And it felt to me like you were quite hesitant about the idea of a director's vision or a director's concept. So I'm thinking, for example, about your very famous book now, A Director's Craft, which goes through the painstaking steps of analysing text and working out what the ideas are in a play, but doesn't have an awful lot to say about the idea of vision or concept when it comes to directing.
Oh, it's so interesting because I jumped over 2 paragraphs because I was aware of the time, so I took a cut in the middle. And maybe that's when everyone thought, what's she doing? That's a really weird jump there. Yeah, so I took a jump because I was worried about time, and that was explaining exactly that. So when I first started doing naturalism, if I was doing Ibsen, I would go to Norway, I would do my research, and I would reconstruct a totally lifelike sort of naturalism. But I didn't address the gender politics in it or any of the other awful politics in the play, and I didn't question naturalism. But of course, over time, I realised that I needed to address the gender politics in this material. So I started to sort of angle what I was doing with the naturalism. And then as I went to Germany, I took a bigger jump, and it would actually sort of centre marginalised female characters who had, like the cook or like with Ophelia's Zimmer, where I directed Hamlet from the point of view of what happens in Ophelia's bedroom. We did most of the play. We cut 98% of the text went, but we did the play. Yeah. So I think probably just as I was going into Germany, I was realising that there was this other thing that the director needs to do. It isn't just the play and then put it there. It's the play and then ask the question, why do the play now? Answer that, then ask how, and then direct the play. So there was a step which isn't talked about in Britain, which is a conceptual step in between reading the play and staging the play. And I think that's because of the tyranny of the writer. The writer's just at the top of the pecking order here. So everyone's told to follow the author's wishes, when in fact if the author is a misogynist, it's no point following the person's wishes. You've got to attack them or critique them. So I think I just unconsciously I was making that transition, and going to Germany just accelerated it. And in fact, I'm rewriting the book. Great. In order to add that step in.
Yeah, and I imagine working in a culture, in the British culture in the noughties, where there were some quite Europhobic criticisms of your work, very misogynist criticisms of your work, really positioning you as an auteur, as a vandal, as a proponent of a kind of model of director's theatre that was quite abusive of playwrights, that I imagine that it was quite important to kind of defend your approach in the British culture. Whereas when you moved to Germany, it sounds like you've been really encouraged to embrace this idea of your own positionality and how that impacts on the vision that you have for the work.
Yeah, I just realised the mistake I made. It was very interesting because I've watched other directors who are in the same auteur vein, and what they do, they're very cunning. They rewrite the play and then direct it. So that's the thing that I should have done here. I should have just rewritten it and then directed it. Then I would have been the writer, and then I wouldn't have received the criticism, you see. So I realised that's very cunning strategy that they have, but definitely it was so amazingly beautiful to be in a country that actually wanted to have this sort of conceptual frame put on pieces of work. And I would pinch myself all the time. I go, oh my God, no one's saying don't do it. I was just waiting, for this big hand. Listen, Katie. I was just waiting for it, and it never came. Although, to be honest, I still had the same criticism about low lighting levels in Germany. So it wasn't a perfect place.
Just one last thing I'd like to ask, which is I was really captivated by what you said about nothing being more beautiful than a cross-cultural team and cross-cultural collaboration. And that's one of the things that I really value about your contribution to theatre, especially over the last 15 years with the transnational collaborations in Germany and France and elsewhere. But I'm thinking of one particular example of a co-production between the Royal Court and the Schaubühne, which was Ophelia Zimmer. And I suppose that was one of the rare examples where a show that you made in Germany or for a German theatre actually did come over and had a run in London. And I'm wondering if you've got anything to say about that experience.
Yeah, I nearly put it in, but it would get too long. It was a beautiful experience because it was an authentic co-production between the Royal Court and the Schaubühne, and there was the playwright Alice Birch involved, and also the set designer Chloe Lamford. And so, but it was a bit arse about tit because we rehearsed it in the UK with British actors Alice then wrote in response to the rehearsal. We then went to Germany, left the UK actors behind, and then we worked with the German actress, took it over, and then we put it on its feet, and then we moved, and then it went into German. And then it opened in Germany, and then it came back to the UK in German with English surtitles. So it was quite a complex transaction. But I think it was an enormous, a very significant moment, because it proved that there could be co-productions between the UK and a European country without this sort of fear of the language problem. Do you see what I mean? So it proved it was possible. And I'm pretty sure we'll be able to pioneer some more projects like that in the future. I'm optimistic about these cross-cultural events and activities, particularly at this moment.
I really am as well, and I think that you've played a vital role, an essential role, in sort of modelling that for younger generations of practitioners. Because I really do feel that over the last 15 years there have been big shifts in British culture, and there is more plurality, more diversity to the kind of approaches to directing and making performance certainly than there was in the noughties. So I think your trajectory has really helped to make that advance happen. Okay, I've monopolised this for too long, so we've got about 15 minutes or so. Let's see if anyone's got any questions. We've got one on the front row.
Thank you. Hi, so exactly on that last point, you talk about having these international teams where you've got a British crew and a German crew. Do you ever work with actors in that same sense, so you have a mixed team of actors that you do these productions with, or is it something that you'd be interested in for the future?
I think it would be a really interesting idea, and thanks for bringing it up. The problem is the contracts of the actors, and so each, as Ben was saying, each German theatre has its own fixed ensemble, and they don't bring in very many freelance performers. They try to reduce that. So it's quite hard to not only bring in a German freelancer, but to bring in a British freelancer would be quite hard. So, but let's see. Maybe that's something that you can do in the future. That would be great if you could. And do get in touch, and I'll give you any support I possibly can. But yes, it would be a great thing to do, but it's not been possible really because of how the ensemble systems are set up in Germany.
And there's another question at the back.
Thank you. Full of admiration, respect. A few questions. In your time, have you drawn on or have you formed views on Brechtian practice? Because I'd be interested to hear what those are.
No. I did edit out a little bit earlier as well, where I did go to the Berliner Ensemble when I was about 26, and I studied in the archive there, an amazing, do you know those books where they took photographs of Brecht's performance once every few minutes, and there's these enormous books where you can just turn the pages and see the work. But no, I am a Stanislavski person, not a Brechtian person. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really ever understand it, and my time in Germany didn't improve that.
Yeah, thanks. And in your time in Germany, has your relationship with playwrights, and particularly with contemporary playwrights, changed? And my last question was, is there a theatre that you can think of anywhere in the UK that you feel is particularly interesting and kind of out there in terms of the kind of practice you've been talking about this evening?
Well, I think the new diorama is very, very exciting. And I was really doing, as we were coming out of lockdown in that period and we've entered this awful crisis, I was really excited that there was a theatre that took a decision because of what was happening to not perform for a season, and instead to put the money into thinking and reflecting what type of work we should make in this post-COVID world with the cost of living crisis. So I thought that was really exciting. And then blow me down, the man who runs it is now taking over the Royal Court, which is just like a really, really exciting time. And as we all know, actually, in London, masses of theatres are changing their artistic directors at the moment. So the Donmar, the National, I think there's a real, and Royal Courts, there's a real possibility, I think, of change, which is very exciting. But I would say the new diorama and now the Royal Court, I would say. And your middle question, which was about has it changed my relationship to writers? Yeah. I felt a bit freer, let's say, to change things. If the writer's dead, I just can change and take a big pair of scissors out and cut it up and paste it around, whatever. If the writer's living and I'm directing their show, I would still feel a sort of real need to, if it's the first outing of the play, to very much honour their wishes and the author's intention. And that it wouldn't be conceptual directing like I would do with dead writers' texts. It would be another act, another creative act, which would be support a new piece of work being first staged. So I would pull back my conceptual tools to do something else. So no, I don't think it has changed the relationship to writers.
Okay, thank you.
Was there another question? Yeah, over here.
Yeah, thank you. My question is about your self-definition as a feminist director. Does that mean different things in Germany and in the UK, and how would you define it for yourself?
Yeah, such a good question. Thank you very much. I think it's a really complex area, and the term is very sort of contested. So I'm a second wave feminist, brought up with the 1970s way of thinking about it, and I'm still running to catch up with fourth wave feminism. I've got masses to learn, particularly about intersectionality. And I'm not that au fait with what is going on in Germany, but I imagine it is as complex as what is going on here. So I'm actually pulling back from using the word feminist and talking more, or trying to, about being interested in focusing on female experience, because I think that's a sort of more useful position to adopt, because I think it's offensive to lots of maybe younger generation feminists for me to claim that word. Maybe it's for them to claim the word, not for me. Is that just...
Any other questions? Yeah, there's one in the fourth row back here.
Thank you. She says, falling over herself. Hi, I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm very, very interested, my genesis was in cinema, was to know about this concept of live cinema and what your influences were in terms of female filmmakers, and if that played any part in the way in which you realised the work. I'd love to know a bit about that.
Yes, I suppose Jane Campion and Chantal Akerman are probably the really, really big influences in terms of film, and they would influence both the sort of the way that the film script gets written and also the way it's shot. So particularly Chantal Akerman, the amazing film that she made, which was about a woman who was a mum who had to do sort of afternoon prostitution, and this sort of really, really fantastic way of telling the story of that woman in terms of how the shots are put together with very little language and lots of very detailed lifelike behaviour. And then obviously Jane Campion, I mean, she's just so beautiful aesthetically, how she's framing and constructing everything is absolutely exquisite. So those two filmmakers definitely a huge influence. But in terms of theatre and film, Liz Lecomte from the Worcester Group was hugely important. And then in the 80s, Hesitate and Demonstrate, Geraldine Pilgrim, amazing sort of visual artists who also influenced the shaping of the live cinema work.
It's actually a great recording of you talking about the Worcester Group and Liz Lecomte in the British Library Sound Archive.
How interesting is that, Ben? Let's all go down there.
But I think it's from the early 2000s. To You, The Birdie, a Fedra adaptation. And it was fascinating for me as a researcher who's interested in Katie's work to hear her responding to that piece in the moment, you know, and seeing the seeds of ideas that later come to fruition in the live cinema work.
Amazing artist, Liz Lecomte, really amazing.
I think we've got time for one final question, and there's a hand up just over here.
what differences would you acknowledge or want to talk about in terms of working in opera instead of theatre, and in between the two, in terms of concept and process?
Well, opera, it's basically 35 to 37 operas are done regularly globally. So that's the canon, and that's mostly what opera audiences go to watch and what opera directors make. So the audiences aren't coming to see the story. What they're coming to see is the concept. So what's really useful about opera is you can practice concept. But there's a problem which is really profound and sort of sad, really, which is the audiences don't want the director's concept. That's the thing that's really interesting about opera. You think, why am I doing it? They just so obviously don't want a feminist deconstruction of Lucia di Lammermoor. This might just be, they don't want to see a miscarriage live on stage and me representing female lived experience. Why am I here? You know, I go out on the stage, boo. Okay, I know, I get it, fine. But I was asked to do it. You know, you need to boo the people who asked me to do it. So it's a really sort of really weird art form, you know, because you're brought to do something that the audience genuinely don't want to see. They'd really like to close their eyes. In fact, sometimes they do. I look around me and they're all got their eyes closed. They're all listening to this beautiful music. But to be honest, I'm out of opera. It's way too misogynistic for me. I've done enough. But it's a tricky art form. Yeah, very, very. It makes me laugh. It really does.
Well, I think on that note, that brings us to the end of the evening, although we will be carrying on upstairs with wine and conviviality. So if you'd like to join us for that, please do. I'd just like to end by thanking you, Katie, for your wonderful lecture and just for sharing an insight into your working practice with such generosity and humour as well. It's been delightful. Thank you.